What's up, everybody? I'm being a boomer today. I couldn't find my headphones, couldn't get my green screen going, couldn't get a lot of things going. So this is what you get. Big earphone mic. I got my Beats on, Beats by Dre. We're not sponsored. But anyway, we're gonna have Dr. Ryan Mullins come in and talk about classical theism, its potential problems, some of the work that Dr. Mullins has been doing that I think a lot of you are familiar with. But those that are not, you are in for a treat. And so I'm just going to go ahead and actually just bring Dr. Mullins in. And Dr. Mullins, how can we introduce you so that, because I think if you're like me, I kind of like just to get into it, but I also want to be respectful. And you spent all this time with work at school and university. And so we got to give you your due diligence. So yeah,
Sure.
tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I have a PhD from the University of St. Andrews and then a doctoral habilitation from the University of Helsinki. So I'm technically a doctor, which is, I don't know, that's something, I guess. And then I'm a lecturer and researcher in theology and philosophy at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. And then I'm a visiting professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And then I'm also a docent of dogmatics at Helsinki. Most of my work is in philosophical theology. I've published a few books. One is called The End of the Timeless God. Another's called God in Emotion. I did a Spanish version of that, which is longer, but I don't speak Spanish, so I can't really tell you much about it. I'm hoping the translation's good. I don't know. And then I've got another book coming out soon-ish in a few months called A Little Book About a Big God, which is going to be an introduction to philosophical theology. And then I've got a sequel to my first book on The End of the Timeless God called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. So it's just exploring what does it mean to say that God's temporal. And then I'm working on a few other books, but yeah, that's enough for the moment.
Just a few.
Just a few. Yeah.
Just a few stuff. Yeah. And you also apparently, like, we talked a little bit on TikTok, and like a little bit Italian. So maybe we just switch this up, and you and Cease just do the whole entire podcast in Italian.
Just Italian. I can only speak in the present tense. I know a little bit of stuff about food, and I can swear. And then the other stuff I forget. So.
I learned one cuss word to tell Cease one time, and that was basically the extent of it. I think it was, and he was impressed, and I was like, well, I Googled it. So, it's not really much impression there. Cease, before I guess we go into classical theism, anything you want to say?
No, I was going to ask, like, what part of Italy have you traveled to?
So my wife is from Le Ricci, which is right next to the La Cinque Terre. So it's like northwest, and so I've been to Pisa, I've been to Milan, I've been to Rome, but mainly, we usually just go back flying to Pisa and then go over to the region.
I grew up in Rome, but I've also spent more time in the south, so like Naples, Ischia, the Amalfi Coast. I haven't seen much of the north.
Oh, I forgot. I've been to Sicily as well, because the Lucerne program that I teach for, we do a summer conference / summer school for the master's students, and we alternate between Sicily and Switzerland, nice. Because my boss is Sicilian.
Okay, cool. Well, Mike, take it away, and then I think maybe at halftime of the show, I'll jump in with my concerns.
Yeah, and we're gonna do this for about an hour. We want to be considerate to Dr. Mullins' time considerations. If you see me squirming around, by the way, I have a rib injury, so I'll probably be leaning that way and that way, but just ignore me and focus on Dr. Mullins. So, Dr. Mullins, first thing I wanted to kind of set this up with is just, what is classical theism? What's kind of constitutive of accepting classical theism? What are the kind of core tenets, so to speak?
Yeah, so you could do the Edward Feser style, where you say it's the only view that affirms that God's perfect. Or you could do the real scholarly thing and say, no, hang on, that's not quite right. So I'm going to do the real scholarly thing. So the concept of God is that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And that's what like all different models of God agree on. You see this in Eastern religions as well. When they're debating whether or not God exists, they're assuming God is perfect and is the ultimate foundation of reality, if God exists. From there, you start to ask questions like, what does it mean to be perfect? And then what does it mean to be the foundation of reality? And so classical theism says that God's the foundation of reality in terms of creating the universe out of nothing. Mm-hmm. Other models of God agree on that too, so that's not really super unique to classical theism. Here is what is unique. So they'll say that God is timeless, God is immutable, God is impassible, God is simple. And then when it comes to omniscience, they're going to say God's created a universe where the future is completely settled, so he knows what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So those four main attributes are usually the things that are supposed to distinguish classical theism from the other models, because everyone's like maximal power, maximal goodness, perfect rationality, perfect freedom,
Sure,
all that kind of stuff. Like that's not really contested, whereas timelessness, immutability, impassibility, simplicity, like those are hotly contested.
Sure. And speaking of, I think simplicity is probably the one that the audience might be the most, well, I'm saying most familiar, but with your work and which we'll get to kind of potential issues with classical theism and divine simplicity. But could you state briefly what the doctrine of divine simplicity is? I know there might be some people that might, there's always this kind of, well, express it this way or that way. And so how would you characterize it?
So I characterize it the way it's actually characterized throughout history, which is technically it's the divine attribute which says God has no attributes, which is incoherent, but that's not my fault. So Shahrastani in the 10th century pointed this out, saying, "Yep, here's these different views that Muslims disagree over, and divine simplicity says God has no attributes, God has no properties, God has no tropes, no immanent universals, nothing of the sort." The idea is you've got this thing, maybe not even a thing, depending on who you ask, that is God. Everything that's essential to God is identical to God.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to say God's powerful, God's wise, you have to say, well, those things are identical to each other and identical to God and identical to his absolutely necessary existence. And then you, from there, any sort of distinctions you want to make, typically, doesn't matter what kind of distinctions you typically want to make, you have to get rid of those. Because what you see, the claim from like Anselm, from Avicenna, from Gregory of Nyssa, from even Descartes, is that whatever can be divided in the mind can be divided in reality. So if I could somehow divide up the attributes or the actions of God or whatever, then I can divide those things in reality, apparently. I don't know how you do that, but this is the claim. So the idea is all of God's actions are all identical to each other, such that there's one divine act. And this one divine act is identical to God's essence and existence. So it's identical to his absolutely necessary existence. And so Catherine Rogers, when she's articulating this, she'll just say, yeah, like God just is an act. I know it sounds super weird, but saying something super weird is not an objection, so who cares? Like that's the way Kate tries to defend it.
Yeah, and so I've heard it expressed like, I don't know if it's like, hopefully I don't get this wrong, but I think it's like the Augustinian kind of way of everything that is in God, God has, everything God has, or everything within God, God has, everything God has is within him. I can't remember.
So everything in God is God.
Is God, yeah.
Because you need those identity statements. So those are, because those identity statements, we're talking about strict numerical identity. So God is good. Well, he just is goodness. God is beautiful. He just is beauty. Beauty just is the existence of God.
So his omnipotence is his omnibenevolence, which is his necessary knowledge, which, Okay, and so one concern, at least it seems that sticks out, is that when you talk about God as this necessary act, is that like if you think about like contrasting worlds that kind of could be subsequent from this initial ontological item being God. If you're like standing in one world looking kind of back, right, there's all the facts are the same, such that in the other world you look back and all the facts are the same, and it seems that there's no contrasting difference such that allows you to get these kind of contingent possible worlds, so to speak. And so that brings up an issue on a modal collapse, that all these possibilities just collapse into necessity. And I know you've done some work on that, so could you take us kind of through the modal collapse issues? And then I know Joe's given a response. We've talked about this briefly, and I think you think that might go wrong because it's not actually a characterization that classical theists are going to want to hold to.
Oh, yeah.
That being the indeterministic link. But I've said a lot, so I'll kind of pause it there.
Yeah, so let me set it up a bit. So when we're talking about modality, we're talking about things like necessity and contingency. And so when you have a modal collapse, what you're saying is either everything's absolutely necessary or everything's absolutely contingent. Like there's just the one category. It's all been collapsed to one category. You could have distinctions within necessity if you want. Like this is how Avicenna tries to get out of some of these problems I'm about to talk about, but you still have just everything's necessary. And he's like, yep, that's right. And Catherine Rogers, same thing. She's like, yep, everything's necessary. What do you want? So here's what you do. So you focus in on several different claims that classical theism explicitly endorses. So one of the things they endorse is what's called the infallibility of omnipotence. Mm-hmm. If God wants to bring about some state of affairs, he's going to get it. Like it just has to obtain.
If he wants a dank ice cream, he's getting the dank ice cream.
He's going to get it, exactly. So when God creates a universe on classical theism, it's not just creating a universe, just like, I just want some cosmic stuff. It's, I want this specific timeline and everything that obtains in this timeline. That's what classical theism says. Because remember, I said classical theism claims that God creates a universe that has a settled future and he knows it. So when if God's infallible in his omnipotence, if he says, I want this universe with this super specific timeline where everything occurs exactly as I want it to, then he's going to get it. What the classical theist says, though, is God doesn't have to create that universe because he's free to do this or do that or do nothing at all. And you're like, okay, cool. But he has, in fact, decided, I want to create this universe with this super specific timeline. Okay. Now here's where the things get weird. The classical theist says all of God's actions are identical to each other, such as there's one divine act. And you're like, okay, so God's act to create this universe and this super specific timeline, it's all one act.
Yeah.
Well, that one act is identical to God's absolutely necessary existence. Mm-hmm. You're like, oh gosh, okay. Well, anything that's identical to absolute necessity is going to be absolutely necessary. I mean, that's just identity. That's just how identity works. And so what that means is God's act to create this universe is absolutely necessary on pain of violating the identity claims of divine simplicity. And so like, well, great. So now this universe exists of absolute necessity, because if God's really omnipotent and omnipotence is infallible, he necessarily creates this universe and it necessarily obtains. And so you just get all these necessities all the way through. If that's the case, then that claim about, well, God could have created a different universe or no universe at all, that's gone. Because
and omnipotence with it, presumably.
There's a debate there. I think you lose omnipotence, but we can get to that in a minute.
Yeah, I'd be on your side on that. But yeah, like with anything in philosophy, keep the door open, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I try to be as charitable as you can, but without being so charitable, you just go, no, we're just saying crazy stuff.
Yeah,
you don't want to do that. But that's the idea, is you end up losing God's ability to do otherwise, and so you end up losing the source of contingency. Mm-hmm. That the classical tradition typically affirmed. So Gloria Frost has a lot of really good work on this, where she tries to look at, here's all the sources of contingency and all these different medieval philosophers. But the main thing is, it's supposed to be grounded in God's freedom to do this or that. But since we've got God's creating this universe is identical to his absolutely necessary existence, that ability to do otherwise is gone. Mm-hmm. And so that's why everything's absolutely necessary. So yeah, and people like Avicenna and Catherine Rogers are just like, yep, that's life. Everything's necessary. What do you want? I think it's a serious problem, but at least, they're just going like, yeah, who cares? What's the big deal?
Sure. Yeah, and so there's kind of another response to say, at least what Joe points out, is that, well, you could have this necessary act, but you could adopt a kind of biconditional statement, right? So something like, you could get some different effect if and only if there's some indeterministic link between God's necessary act and then, I guess, the effect that's produced. And so I kind of am curious, do you think Joe's successful on that? Do you think that this kind of goes with your mantra of, I don't really advise defending classical theism by defeating classical theism? Does it fall into that camp in your perspective, or is it, do you think Joe's onto something? Have you had to reconsider your work there? Or how do you take that?
When I look at it, like, it really is defending classical theism by way of denying it. Like, mm-hmm. you lose the infallibility of omnipotence, and that's like the first premise in my argument. And I'm like, well, here's what Aquinas and Scotus and like all these other people are like, yep, this is the view. And so I'm like, mm-hmm. You've lost that.
Yeah.
Here's why you've lost it. Because remember, the claim was, if God like acts to bring about X, then he's going to get X. Like whatever X is, like he's going to get it. On this indeterministic causation view, what you're saying is God wills to bring about something, but it might not happen. And I'm like, hey, let's think about that for a second. So God's like looking at all the universes he could create, and he's like, I want number 99. Out of all the universes, number 99 is pretty cool. I want that. He snaps his fingers, and then nothing happens. And he's like, ah, crap. Okay, let me try again. Okay, let's get it right. And he like snaps his fingers, and then like universe like 2073 like pops into existence. And God's like, oh gosh, that's a terrible universe. I didn't want that. Let me try again. And I'm like, hang on, is this really an omnipotent being?
Yeah.
Like that's not an omnipotence. This is just nuts. I mean, that's just all it is, just plain nuts. What Joe and I have successfully done is push people, some different contemporary classical theists, to be like, yeah, this is what we want. And I'm like, really? You want to just say completely crazy things that make your view implausible? That's fine.
Yeah, which has the intentional collapse entailment or providential collapse. Right?
Yeah, because you can't get providence. Because if God, every time God snaps his fingers, he doesn't know what's going to happen at all. There's no way you could have providence.
Yeah.
So it's pretty devastating. So if you're looking at not just classical theism, but like a whole system of theology, be it Christian or Islamic or Jewish, doesn't matter, or even Hindu, if you're losing that element, your whole system of theology just falls apart.
Yeah.
So it's pretty devastating.
And hence, you don't advise, defending classical theism by defeating it.
By denying it, yeah. Exactly.
By denying it. Sorry. And okay, so that sums up a lot for me on the kind of modal collapse issues. I do want to, before I move on to kind of the aloneness stuff, a friend of mine, Amdir, has a question. It says, as a follow-up, can we ask about whether or not the classical theist can say that one absolutely necessary act non-rigidly designates? So kind of like Kripke's non-rigid designator, right?
Yeah, so I keep noticing people doing this, and I find this odd. So that's a theory of reference, and we're not talking about references here. We're talking about like strict identity claims, like metaphysical like claims about God. We're not talking about references here. So all this stuff about theory of reference, I think, is missing the point and is talking about something else. Mm-hmm. Further, Brian Leftow pointed out, I think it was back in 2006, that if we're really focusing on the actual identity claims of divine simplicity, then they have to be rigid designators. Otherwise, we're not talking about identity. Sure. So he just kind of dismisses it in a sentence going, well, yeah, that's just what identity entails. There have to be. So if you don't like that if they seem like they're non-rigid, that just shows you, that should convince you or give you reasons for thinking, well, then these claims can't be identity claims.
It seems to fall out for free under classical theism. No, I mean, mm-hmm. like so it is I don't know, maybe I have to think about that as well. Maybe Amdir has something.
No, I mean, Catherine Rogers and William Vallicella are very clear on this. They're just like, we're talking about like all these things that we refer to God as they just are God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it just, you get it for free. And Augustine's pretty clear about that too. He's like, if you say God's beautiful, God's good, God's wise, he has a list of things. Infinity is not on the list because he doesn't think God's infinite. That's a story for another day. But he's like, when you're saying all those things, you're just saying the same thing.
Sure.
Is what it is how he ends that statement. He's like, say this, that you're saying the same thing. So the designation should just fall out from the identity claims themselves.
That seems incoherent to me.
That like, that everything's, it sounds like gobbledygook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Evan Fales, actually I've heard a lot of people say this. So Evan Fales is this really great atheist philosopher. I got to work with him for a year. We had a fellowship together at Notre Dame. And I remember when I was starting to work on some of this stuff and I was explaining divine simplicity, he just goes, whoa, this is just gobbledygook. Like, why are we even doing this? And he's not the only one. So T.J. Mawson, he wants to defend a lot of classical claims, but doesn't want to go all the way. So he wants to give you timelessness. He wants to give you immutability. He wants to give you not impassibility, but something in the neighborhood.
Sure.
And then when he comes to simplicity, he has this hilarious line in his book on the divine attributes. He says, we should have just put our hands up and said stop to the whole conversation as before we got to this whole claim that all of his attributes are identical to each other. He's like, we should have just been like, no, we're done with this.
There's I've never been a theist or a Christian or a theist, but I've kind of seen like why someone would find that attractive in their theory, like prima facie, right? They're just kind of like thinking about it, but then until you kind of see the entailments, but I could see like why someone wanted divine, like it makes sense from the best that I can do to kind of permeate the theist mind until you kind of look at the work behind it and how the framework itself kind of has all these kind of weird unnoticed consequences. And so speaking of like some strange unnoticed consequences that fall out from the view, let's talk about the alone world. Maybe you want to go into a brief summary about the aloneness argument, and then we can we're making really good time, so we might be able to get to timelessness before I pass it on to Cease for the kind of worldview comparison stuff. So yeah, how would you want to start that out?
So remember earlier I said the concept of God is that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so classical theism says the way that God is the foundation of reality is in terms of creation out of nothing. So creation out of nothing says that prior to the beginning of the universe, there's God all alone. There's some people today who want to deny that that's what that means. There's this thing called actual history that you have to look at, and it says, no, this is what that actually means. So this is the way, like, for example, Boethius, Al-Ghazali, and Moses Maimonides, so hit up all three Abrahamic religions. That's the way they understood creation out of nothing.
Can I ask you real quick?
Mm-hmm.
What's up? Like, why does every time Gregory Pine bring up Boethius, he was just like, so have you noticed that? I do every time I see him in a debate, he does that, and it confuses the shit out of me.
I don't pay attention to that guy.
Is that like a meme or like a thing that's going on between classical theists? I'm always like, seems like a very random thing to do to Boethius. But all right, anyway.
It feels random to me. I don't get it.
He did it in Joe's debate and somewhere else, and I was like, oh, this is a thing. Okay.
Yeah, I saw it in the debate with Joe, and I was like, what is that? So I don't know. I don't know, whatever.
Twice in that debate, I think, and I was like, wait, this is okay. I'm not smartened up to the Boethius, you know. But anyway.
I don't know. But yeah, so the claim is there's a state of affairs. It's supposed to be a timeless state of affairs where God exists all alone without any universe whatsoever. Sometimes it's called pre-eternity in a lot of medieval discussions, but you've got God all alone. And then, at the end, then has to be understood timelessly somehow. No one's been able to figure that out. And then you've got God with all this cosmic stuff. Mm-hmm. So Joe and I focus in on that, plus the claim from Divine Simplicity that God has no accidental features. So God has no accidental features. Well, if God's omniscient, it seems like he would know that he exists all alone. Like that's the sum total facts of reality are such that God exists all alone. Mm-hmm. And part of being omniscient is knowing the sum total facts of reality. Yeah. And if God plus a universe exists, well, then the sum total facts of reality are God plus a universe. So, well, God should know that.
I think I'm going to stop reading any philosophy when that part's debated. I'm just like, all right, you guys can just argue about everything at this point.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it seems really obvious. Like, right, like if God's omniscient, he's going to know that the universe exists. And so what we do is we look at, okay, the classical claim again, like I said earlier, is supposed to be that God's free to create or not create, and he's free to create any number of universes. Doesn't have to be this one. Any way you go, God's going to have some sort of accidental feature because his knowledge is going to be, I exist all alone, but I could create stuff, or I exist with this universe, could create some other ones, doesn't matter. Either way you go, there's going to be an accidental feature about God's knowledge.
Sure.
You could do the same thing for God's actions and other such stuff, but we just focus on the knowledge. So in the alone world, God should know he's all alone, and that would be like a contingent, accidental feature of God. So that's the idea. It's like the simplest version of it.
Yeah, so you point out God in the alone world has knowledge, right? He's identical to his knowledge, but it turns out that in the alone world, right, it's not necessary that God is
alone,
not just ontologically prior, but just alone, right?
Right.
And so that falls out that God has contingent knowledge, which is identical to, and that's no. And so
right, because contingency can't be identical to necessity.
Sure, yeah, and so so in one of the premises, God has an accident. I always like to, when I explain this argument to people, to call it the God wet the bed argument, because you guys have the languages, so God has an accident. And so I always call it the God wet the bed argument.
I like it.
The alone, I have to admit, I know Joe and you want this to further the discussions and not bash, classical theists over the head, but I will probably lie if I said I wasn't guilty for once or twice kind of using the aloneness argument to bash someone over the head with. I mean, not in a negative way, I don't think, and just kind of like, hey, I think this is a problem, and I want to see how you address it. But and that kind of gets me to Christopher Tomaszewski's work. Mm-hmm. We briefly talked about that. Is there any work? I'm not as familiar with his work. I know that he obviously takes issue to a lot of the aloneness stuff. So, do you think you could kind of explain what his issues are, or maybe just in general issues that other classical theists have, and what they're trying to do to get around this, so we can?
So the three main moves I've seen well, there's a few main moves. One, so what Tomaszewski does, he does a few things. So he focuses on the modal collapse argument. So he's published on that.
Okay.
And what he does is he articulates an argument that I and Brian Leftow and like, I don't know, basically an argument that I don't know anybody who's actually endorsed it, and then declares it invalid. And I'm like, okay, well, don't say this is my argument, Brian Leftow's argument, because it's not. Like,
Yeah.
Sorry, bro. And then he gets into this muddled kind of discussion about rigid or non-rigid designators. But I'm like, well, Brian Leftow already addressed all that, so we mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, if you look at the actual claims of classical theism, I don't know what you're up to anymore. And people have already responded to that. So Johnny Waldrop has I don't know if the paper's out yet or if it's still forthcoming, where he looks at like even Tomaszewski's version of the argument and goes, well, even this we can make valid if we look at what classical theism actually says. Mm-hmm. And so you're like, oh, okay, that's a problem. Another move you could make is with the aloneness argument, you could say God's knowledge is exactly the same across all possible worlds. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what on earth does that mean? Because surely a world in which a universe exists plus God, and a world where it's God without a universe, or God plus a multiverse, those should all be different knowledge states.
Yeah, I was so confused. Wait, yeah. So his claim is that the knowledge would be the same across worlds, but there's a contrasting difference across worlds, right?
Yeah. So one move you can do to try to be like, no, it's not as bad as you think. You could do this weird thing that Eleanor Stump does, where you say it's just a completely different modality you don't understand. But what Brian Leftow and others do is go, we can translate this modality into possible world semantics. It's the same. So yeah. Another move you could do is you could just invoke these magical Cambridge properties and just say everything's a Cambridge property.
Sure.
I don't know what that means.
It's the rage today.
Yeah, it's all the rage.
All the rage.
So TJ Mawson says like these are just these weird pseudo Cambridge properties, and creating a universe is just not that, because Cambridge properties are supposed to be these relational properties, and creating a universe, like that's something intrinsic to you. Like you perform an action and bring something about, like that's intrinsic to you. It's not a relationship, just a merely relationship. So it just seems weird. And also Divine Simplicity says God can't have any accidental properties, and Cambridge properties are accidental properties. And they're relational properties, and the claim from Augustine, Boethius, Peter Lombard, Aquinas, Scotus, and on James Arminius is God's not really related to the universe, and they say that precisely to avoid God having relational properties. So the appeals to Cambridge properties I don't know what it's doing. Yeah. So it seems like they're denying classical theism by denying.
Yeah. Yeah.
The final move. Yeah, it's pretty bad. The final move to make is you make all of God's knowledge extrinsic. I'm going to try to do my best to make sense of it. I find it unintelligible.
Even in the alone world, like when there's nothing apart from, like, because there isn't anything apart from God such that you'd have the feature, right?
Yeah, that's what it seems like you'd have to say. But the way the extrinsic account of divine knowledge is, I mean, I guess you could kind of try to split the difference. You could say like God's knowledge of himself is like intrinsic, but his knowledge of everything else is extrinsic. So here's what you say is God's knowledge of the universe is just reducible to the statement that there are a bunch of facts out there that exist about the universe. And I'm like, well, does God know it? And they're like, yeah, because knowing it means like there's just these facts out there that exist. He doesn't have like any beliefs. He doesn't have anything like intrinsic to his like mental states or anything like that correspond to this. It's just there's these facts out there, and that's just what his knowledge is. Here's the fun thing. So I am omniscient. You guys did not know that, but it's because I have extrinsic knowledge.
Yeah.
There's nothing internal that you can point to me and be like, well, do you know what's going on the other side of the universe? No, but there's a fact out there.
They're just stripping away any meaning of the words that we use in the context of knowledge, and altogether
Yes.
it doesn't mean anything.
Yes, exactly. And this is the main objection to this view. And so W. Matthews Grant has a whole chapter on it in his book on universal divine causality, where he tries to address this unintelligibility objection. And when I got to the end of it, I really felt like I've lost even more of my grasp on what this was supposed to be. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's just super weird, and I don't really know what it means anymore to say God has knowledge, because it seems like I can easily get omniscience the same way,
I
and that's
have
not
the
right.
I have the same problem you're expressing when I hear the words God exists outside of space and time.
Mhm.
I have the same problem there.
Well, that actually would
Mm.
segue us in really well to the
Mhm.
timelessness stuff. But I want to be respectful to Cease as well,
Oh, sure.
and divide the time as best as I can.